My name is Ann Olmschneider, and I'm a member of the Eighth Principle Task Force, which is a group supporting the racial justice work in our church. I'm going to read an excerpt from the letter from Birmingham Jail by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I have been disappointed with the white church and its leadership. I do not say that as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say it as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who was nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. I had the strange feeling when I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery several years ago that we would have the support of the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be some of our strongest allies. Instead, some few have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. In spite of my shattered dreams of the past, I came to Birmingham with the hope that the white religious leadership of the community would see the justice of our cause and, with deep moral concern, serve as the channel through which our just grievances could get to the power structure. I had hoped that each of you would understand. But again, I have been disappointed. I have heard numerous religious leaders of the South call upon their worshipers to comply with a desegregation decision because it is the law. But I have longed to hear white ministers say, "Follow this decree because integration is morally right, and the Negro is your brother." In the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churches stand on the sidelines and merely mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I have heard so many ministers say, "Those are social issues which the gospel has nothing to do with." And I have watched so many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which made a strange distinction between bodies and souls, the sacred and the secular. There was a time when the church was very powerful, In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was the thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Wherever the early Christians entered a town, the power structure got disturbed and immediately sought to convict them for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But they went on with the conviction that they were a colony of heaven and had to obey God rather than man. They were small in number, but big in commitment. They brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contest. Things are different now. The contemporary church is so often a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. It is so often the arch supporter of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's often vocal sanction of things as they are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If the church of today does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authentic ring, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. I meet young people every day whose disappointment with the church has risen to outright disgust.
I sent that reading to Anne in an email and got a reply. Wow, this is powerful. It's probably some of the most uncomfortable stuff to hear. These words written in 1963. I was tasked this weekend to do a service about King and center on his writings. There's a lot to go through. So which ones do I choose? Which pieces do you pluck out of that library? There is an argument for the inclusion of the I have a dream speech. It's the speech that seems to be one of the most known of King's. And it's a powerful piece. It's a plea for peace and unity. And I don't know about you, but I could go for a little peace and unity right now. I'm sure all of those who are furloughed are dying for some peace and unity right now. But we're not going to read anything from that speech today. And I've made a very intentional choice in that. The I Have a Dream speech is powerful because it's aspirational. It paints for us a picture of what the global community could look like, of what it would be like to live in a post-racial world, where someone is judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. It's aspirational. But the letter from the Birmingham jail tells us how we get to the promised land. If the I have a dream speech is the promised land, then the Birmingham jail letter is the 40 years in the desert, to use another biblical metaphor. This is about the work that we need to do in order to create the global community. And I've got news for you, it's not easy. It is difficult work, but it needs to be done. For those of you unfamiliar with the history of this letter from the Birmingham jail, it was written on April 16th, 1963. On the 12th of that April, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed in Birmingham for the heinous crime of marching without a permit. See, the people of Birmingham, the black citizens of Birmingham, decided they wanted to march to protest the unjust treatment that they suffered within that city, and so they got a permit to march. And when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was going to join them, the permit got revoked. They didn't want any outsiders in their town. King said, "We march anyway," and was promptly arrested and not treated very well while he was in that jail. Interestingly enough, the very day he was arrested, a letter appeared in the newspaper. It was an open letter to the city of Birmingham signed by 8 white clergy. These 8 white clergy begged that the protests stop. Because if you really want to affect peace, they suggested that the people of color work within the systems of the law. Think about that. Think about people of color working within the systems of the law in 1963, before the Civil Rights Movement. Not like it's any better today. How many of you are aware of what happened in Chicago this week about the police officers? For those of you unaware, in Chicago, 3 police officers were acquitted of conspiracy for trying to hide the fact that one of their fellow officers shot a black man as he was trying to back away slowly. The 3 police officers lied about what happened. And when the videotape was released of that incident, it proved that they lied. Evidence doesn't get harder than that. And what happened? Acquitted. So if you think justice would be found in a 1963 court when it's still hard to find today, I don't know what to tell you. There was no way those men, those black citizens, would find justice on that path, and the Reverend Dr. King knew it. King, while he was in the Birmingham jail, got a copy of the newspaper that contained that letter calling for reason. So he wrote a response. And I would encourage all of you, if you have not read the letter, or if you have not read the letter recently, to read it again. It is fairly easy to find on the internet. But this letter is not for the followers of the Reverend Dr. King. It was not for the people who joined him on marches. It was not for the people who were doing the dangerous work of racial equality. This letter was directed not only at those 8 clergy and the letter that they wrote, but this letter was directed at the lukewarm supporters those who were half-hearted in their committal for racial justice, those who cried, I agree with your cause, but you just need to give it a little more time. Be patient. Don't be so extreme. Work within the system. This was a letter that called out those who supported the ideals of King, but not the means. It was a letter for white moderates. I'm going to read you a part of that letter. Over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goals that you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. It's really easy for us, and I'm very guilty of this, in the gift of hindsight, to look back on 1963, 64, at the civil rights movement, at the marches, and to say without fear that we would most definitely be marching right along Martin Luther King. I want to believe I would be brave enough. But how many times have you ever used the argument, I agree with your ideals, but I don't like how you're going about it? Maybe you're a little extreme when it comes to racial equality. We saw it a lot with the response of all lives matter. Maybe you're being a little extreme, putting yourself front. Well, those are the lives that are being shown to not matter. There's a reason they're in front. In his final sermon, I've been to the mountaintop, King uses that parable of the Good Samaritan, as we heard it read to us today, his deconstruction of it. He used it to illustrate what it looks like to go outside of your comfort zone. He paints this picture of that dangerous path, the path to Jericho, a place where when we see someone lying on the road, our first response is, that's an ambush waiting to happen. What's going to happen to me if I stop? And King reminded us that it was our duty to put the goal, the good of the many, over the good of the self, to reconstruct that. What will happen to them if I don't stop? He says earlier in that sermon, either we go up together or we go down together. Let us develop a kind of dangerous unselfishness. A dangerous unselfishness to risk ourselves. It's a hard risk to take. For a lot of us white people, race is difficult to talk about. It feels like a dangerous topic. We really love the idea of living in a post-racial world. We love the idea of being in a place where no one is discriminated against. We love the idea of welcoming people no matter what they look like. And we still live in a culture that makes it hard for us to be truly welcoming. We still live in a white supremacy culture where the needs of the white people are put above the needs of others. We hear stories in the news of people like Trayvon Martin, Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, Laquan McDonald, young black men who are shot by police officers, shot and killed without a fair trial. And instead, so many of us ask the question, why didn't they cooperate with the police? Instead of asking the question, why are black men shot at a disproportionate rate than white men? Our culture of white supremacy makes it hard to ask those questions. When we hear claims from our friends of color that they are pulled over twice as often as white people for routine traffic stops, instead of asking, why is it that these people are pulled over more often, we will deflect it by saying, well, you know, I got pulled over last week. Or I've been pulled over for no reason as well. Or maybe even, where did you get that data? For so many of us, when we're confronted with the facts about modern day racism, we want to stay in our comfort zone. For us white allies, we act like the priest and the Levite. We stay on our side of the road and keep going because it is easier to do that than to face the horrors on the other side. The most dangerous act of unselfishness an ally can do is to cross that road, to examine the problems of modern racism, to look at how the systems around us perpetuate it, to ask the deep questions about how our court system is run, our penal system, how police are trained nowadays, how the portrayal of people of color in media has tainted our perceptions. When we start to examine our society, our culture, our country, we really start to see that it is skewed to benefit white people and to punish people of color. And when you cross that road and you take a look, you feel guilty. You don't like looking at that. I don't like looking at that. I don't like being reminded that I live in a system that has supported me as a straight, white, male, and given me so much advantage that so many people are denied. And it makes me uncomfortable to think about that. And do you know what that is called? White fragility. It's the idea that when we as white people, when us white people look at the facts of racism in our society, we shut it down within ourselves. We make excuses because it is too much to handle the truth. When we realize that we not only benefit from these systems, but we still work to perpetuate them without even knowing it. It hurts because it shows us at some level we must be racists. And that's the worst word we as a white people can be called. You are a racist. So we don't cross the road. Breathe. I have news for you all. You're not racists. You think of racists in the terms of someone who very intentionally says horrible things to different cultures. And that's not you. But I also want to remind you of one other thing. This isn't about you, my white friends. This is not about you. It's about the person that's on the other side of the road. Don't ask what can happen to me. Don't ask what is going to happen. Don't ask about your own self. Worry about that person on the other side of the road. Do not worry about being ambushed. Work to lift others. Take the risk. Be dangerously unselfish. How? How do we do it? How do we cross that road? How do we take that risk? How do we become better allies, my white friends? If only there was a class that told you how to be an ally. For those of you who are visiting us, there is. An organization called Service Never Sleeps is actually having a class today from, I believe, 1:30 to 7. It's a registration class, so I don't know if you'll be able to join us on such short notice, but I'm willing to bet it will be coming around again. We have these beautiful yellow banners in our fellowship hall that have all of these beautiful multicolored signatures. Our Living the Pledge banners that talk about how we can end racism. And there's a class for that as well, on how to live the pledge, how to be a better ally, how to examine and confront the systems of oppression of which we live and breathe. And if you go, and I hope all of you go to take at least one of these different opportunities, go with an open heart. Go with an open mind. You will get uncomfortable. Lean into it. For those of you who are introverts, we have books. There are books about this as well. I would highly recommend reading Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. It is a book by a white author who talks about race from an ally perspective that is frank and probably more upsetting than it would be if it was a person of color, because she doesn't pull her punches. I would also recommend reading Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. For those of you who are unaware, Ta-Nehisi Coates is an author of color. This book is his talk. He's having the talk with his son, the talk that African American parents have with their boys of color, the talk of how you react to authority, what you need to do in order to be safe because you will be perceived as a threat. It is a frank look about that culture that some of us as white people may not be familiar with. And I would encourage you to read this heartbreaking book. And for those of you who have to stay away from nonfiction and read fiction, Angie Thompson's The Hate You Give is a wonderful nonfiction young adult book about what it is like to live in these times as a young woman of color and dealing with code switching as well as many other issues. And if those aren't enough for you, I am willing to bet you can find podcasts and movies. I am sure we have pamphlets in the back. There are ways to find out more about what it means to be an ally. So take those first steps to investigate. But those are only first steps. The second thing we need to do is to examine what we can do to change the systems of which we live in. King proved to us that if you want to change a system, marching and demonstrating is a great way to do it, and if only we had the nation's capital close by to do so. Showing that you're not alone on an issue is great, but what's even better is for white people to show up for causes led by black leaders and to do as what one of my friends said: show your white face and shut your white mouth. Because I got news for you. I've recognized this. As a straight white man, people listen to me more than others. People who have just as valid opinions, some of them more valid than mine. And if I am there in my support, not saying a thing, looking at them and saying, yes, I agree, giving I can't say giving that person that power, letting that person have the power which they rightfully deserve. That's one of the best things an ally can do. Show up, shut up, let people of color lead. And don't forget, the one thing that I try to really do as a white ally, and it is one of the scariest things I do, is when I hear one of my wonderful white friends say something that is unintentionally harmful. My goal is to make sure that if there's a person of color in the room, they don't have to be the one who has to defend what has been, or who has to respond to what has been said. Because if they do it, often they are painted as someone who is hypersensitive. But again, me, the white guy, if I say it, suddenly it has more power. We've been given power as white people in this society, in these systems. So use it to break it down. And if you see something, say something to your white friends. It is hard. You can do it lovingly, but you do it. And for those of us who are in leadership, what can we do to more directly affect change within the systems of which we have power? How do our systems affect people of color? I have seen this going on within the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association. They've had a lot of struggles of what they can do to be more inclusive to people of color. They've had some horrible incidences of people being treated unfairly, and they're working to fix that. And one of the things that they're working to do is adopting a new principle. This is a principle that has been proposed to help people remember what is important, what is going on. And I have a note here that I lost that I wanted to remind you of, because this principle is controversial. There's a whole table in the back of the fellowship hall that has people staffed who would love to talk to you about the eighth principle. And we will have meetings about the eighth principle and discussions about why it should be adopted. And I want to hear the opinions of those who have issues with it. Your voice needs to be heard. But we're going to vote on this. And we're going to vote on this soon. We're going to hold a special election in this congregation on March 31st to adopt the eighth principle. And I want as many members of this congregation to show up to be ready to vote. And I want you to ask questions about it. And I want you to be prepared. And I want you to remember one thing. It is the white moderate who is more devoted to order than justice, who constantly says, I agree with the goal you seek, but not the methods. When it comes to voting on something like this, we can talk about the methods. We can parse all of the little tiny details, but the goal we seek is inclusion and global community. Keep that in mind on the 31st. This work of anti-oppression for us white folks is hard, and it is important that we do the work. I want to apologize to all of the people of color who are here today. I feel like I did not give you a message. I'm sorry. But I'm going to work on that too. You're needed. Your voice is needed. This work is hard. So I'm going to leave you with one quote from Dr. King, again from his mountaintop sermon. When people get caught up with that which is right, and they are willing to sacrifice for it, there's no stopping short of victory. Let us not be stopped. Let us live into dangerous unselfishness.